The waystation at Vorath-Senn was not a place you came to by choice. It sat at the junction of three minor transit lanes in the outer corridor, a region of space that the major factions had been arguing over for 40 years without agreeing on anything except that it wasn't worth garrisoning properly. The station itself was a converted or processing platform, retrofitted badly in the early years of the compact and never properly renovated since. The corridors were low. The seals leaked cold. The docking arms had been replaced piecemeal over the decades, and now stuck out at angles that made the whole structure look like something had landed on it hard and walked away. I liked it. I had been living on Vorath-Senn for 11 months by the time the Vorath-Senn came through, and I had chosen it precisely because it was the kind of place that did not ask questions. Nobody on a waystation in the outer corridor was there because life had gone exceptionally well for them. The people in the transit cafe on level 3, where I spent most of my evenings, were haulers, salvage workers, contract laborers between jobs, and a rotating population of low-priority travelers who couldn't afford the fast lanes. They shared a common fluency in the language of minding their business. That suited me fine. I want to be honest about what I was doing there. Not hiding, I had nothing to hide from in the actionable sense. My discharge was clean. My record was sealed under a compact security classification that I had not requested and could not remove, which was a different thing from having something to hide. It was simply that the record being sealed was itself a form of description, and the description was one I had spent the better part of 4 years learning not to carry visibly. When you have spent 3 decades in the 14th Reach Infantry, in the specific billets the 14th Reach fills, doing the specific work the 14th Reach does, a retirement is not the soft landing that the compact's discharge documentation implies. You don't stop being what you are. You stop having an assignment. The thing the assignment was built around does not deactivate on discharge day. It just loses its schedule. I had spent the first year after discharge on a compact administrative world in the middle lanes, in a housing block that was clean and temperature controlled, and so thoroughly unremarkable that I had found myself lying awake at 3 in the morning running threat assessments on the ceiling. The second year I spent closer to the outer reach, on a transit hub with more noise and less cleanliness, which was better in the ways that mattered and still not quite right. By the third year I had worked my way out to the outer corridor, and by the time I reached Vorath-Senn, I understood what I was looking for, which was a place where the ambient threat level was low enough to sleep through, but present enough that the part of my brain responsible for threat assessment had something to process and would leave the rest of me alone. Vorath-Senn was calibrated exactly right. The outer corridor had a specific quality of manageable difficulty, occasional frictions, the low-grade tension of a frontier region without the formal military presence to adjudicate disputes, the normal human equivalent problems of a population that lived outside the main lane systems without quite being lawless. I had been required to handle 2 things in 11 months, both minor, neither requiring anything I regretted. The rest of the time I had my table and my drink, and the particular quality of attention that a retired soldier develops when the velocity is gone but the machinery is still running. The table was in the back corner, against the wall, angled so I could see the room without the room seeing much of me. I had been picking that table in every bar and cafeteria and transit lounge I'd sat in for the better part of 30 years, and by now I did it without thinking, the same way I still checked the sightlines when I walked into a new space and cataloged the exits before I ordered anything. Old habits. The kind that save your life enough times that your body just absorbs them and runs them without consulting your brain. I was 61 years old. I was not a large man. I had been at various points in my career considerably more physically imposing than I was now. The muscle packs down after you stop carrying a full combat load every day, and I hadn't run a field operation in going on 4 years. I was lean, which I maintained with some effort. My hair was gray going white, cut short out of habit. I had a face that most people describe charitably as unremarkable. I had a scar along my left jaw from a piece of shrapnel on a world called Pelthai-7 that I rarely thought about anymore, and a deeper one across my ribs from something that had happened on a world I did not name in conversation. I wore civilian clothes. I drank at that stage of my life, a malt spirit produced on a small agricultural station 3 lanes over, which was rough and tasted of wood smoke and cost very little, and I was nursing my second glass of it when the Vorath-Senn came through the main hatch. There were 8 of them. I counted without looking directly at the door, a reflex, not a choice. The sound of their movement told me, the footfall rhythm, the spacing, the weight and cadence of 8 individuals moving in a loose group rather than a civilian scatter. Military bearing. Young. The particular kind of young that comes out of a recent operation still believing the operation was the difficult part. The Vorath-Senn are a reptilian species, broad-shouldered, green-scaled in varying depths from near olive to the deep forest green of their high-cast lines, with heavy brow ridges that give their faces a permanent expression of impending displeasure. They have narrow pupils that dilate laterally in low light, which in the dim ambience of the level 3 cafe made their eyes look gold and large. They are physically powerful, stronger than a human of comparable size in raw static terms, though they telegraph badly and have a rotational range in the shoulder joint that tends to get them into trouble in close work. I knew all of this the way I knew my own shoe size. It was filed information, not threat assessment. I had not assessed the Vorath-Senn as a threat. I assessed the squad leader as worth watching. He was the one in front, the tallest of them, with a campaign stripe on his arm and the particular set to his jaw that young veterans get when they have been through something real and come out believing the thing they are now is the final form. He wore the patrol fatigues of the Vorath-Senn Southern Border Corps, which meant they had been down near the Kethpreen approach corridor, where there had been significant action in the last 2 years. The scar tissue along his left neck ridge was new. The scales hadn't fully reset over it and still showed the paler, rower green of recent healing. He was, by the evidence, someone who had been tested and had passed the test, and he knew it the way young men always know things they have recently learned, absolutely and at volume. His name, I found out later, was Deathworlders. At the time I did not know it and did not need to. They settled at the long bar on the right side of the room. The bartender, an elderly Keth-Sauron female named Vressa, who had been running the level 3 cafe for as long as anyone on the station could remember, poured them the territorial draft that most visiting military preferred, a heavy fermented grain spirit that the Vorath-Senn consumed in quantity with negligible effect on their judgment, which was already not their strongest attribute. There was laughter. The particular laughter of a group that has recently been cooped up somewhere smaller than they liked, and is now expanding back into a larger space, loud and without particular direction. I returned my attention to my glass. The level 3 cafe had 9 other occupied tables, a pair of heavy hauler pilots playing a tile game in the far corner, 3 salvage workers eating together at the center table, one of them already half asleep over her plate, a Kethpreen courier seated alone near the door, reading something off a handheld, not looking up, an elderly Tharvan male, a species I placed from the silhouette, narrow-shouldered, 4-fingered, gray-scaled in the particular bluish-gray of the deep Tharvan fishing clans, sitting alone at the short end of the bar, as far from the door as the room allowed, with a drink in front of him that he had not touched in some time. I noted the Tharvan because he went very still the moment the Vorath-Senn came in, not the still of someone hoping to be ignored. The still of someone who had made a rapid calculation and was now waiting to see how the calculation resolved. I filed that away and returned to my drink. For approximately 20 minutes, nothing happened that required my attention. The Vorath-Senn drank. They talked among themselves in the clipped, elided dialect of the Southern Border Corps, which runs heavy on military shorthand, and light on anything resembling social niceties. They were, from what I could follow at that distance, arguing about the technical merits of a particular boarding action they had apparently participated in, with competing accounts that differed mainly in how central each speaker had been to the outcome. This was a conversation I had heard in various forms, in various species languages, across the better part of my adult life. It is a very old conversation. It never really changes. The first thing that was directed at me was not aggressive. It was the casual kind of dismissal that large young men in groups produce when they become aware of a small, quiet individual occupying space that might otherwise belong to the group. One of them, the one on the end of the bar, heaviest of the 8, scales very dark green going charcoal across the shoulders. A sergeant's band on his wrist looked over at my table, made some assessment, and said something to the man next to him. The man next to him laughed. The sound wasn't directed at me. It was the laughter that happens when someone makes a small remark about the furniture. I kept my eyes on my glass. The second thing took another 10 minutes. One of the younger ones broke from the group and walked to the bar for another round, and on his way back he detoured past my table for no particular reason, except that detouring past my table was available to him. He looked down at me for a moment, the lateral pupils tracking over my face, my clothes, my glass, and then said something in bordercore dialect. His tone was the flat disinterest of someone making an observation, not a challenge. The rough translation of what he said was something like, "Soft worlder far from home," not a question, just a categorization. I looked at him. I did not say anything. He held for a moment, recalibrated. He had expected some response, some acknowledgement of the category, and then walked back to the bar. I heard the heavy sergeant say something that drew another laugh. The translation involved the word for something small and found underground, burrow creature. I did not look up. I want to be clear about something because I have told parts of this story before and people tend to load it up with things that were not in it. I was not angry. I had not been angry in a long time, not in the hot, reactive way, not the kind that pushes you to do something you haven't already decided to do. I had spent too many years in places where anger was a liability. You learn to put it somewhere else. Not gone, exactly. Converted. It becomes a different fuel. Cooler. More patient. You stop needing events to happen on your schedule, and you start letting them happen on theirs, which is the most useful thing I know how to tell a young soldier who will almost certainly not believe me. The truth is that patience is not a virtue you choose. It is a capability you build over years by surviving situations in which impatience would have killed you. The first time I waited out a 3-hour overwatch in a predator migration corridor on Kale Prime at the age of 14, I was not patient by disposition. I was still and cold and frightened and very aware that movement was death. The 14th time, I was merely still and cold. By the 30th time, the fear had been relocated to somewhere more useful. By the time I was running billets in the 14th reach, I had a stillness in me that my unit's medic once described, clinically and without apparent irony, as neurologically anomalous. The officer sitting across the desk from him had nodded as though this was a useful data point about his sergeant major and filed it. The filing cabinet, it turned out, was sealed. I found this out later. I was not angry at the Vorath-Senn in the bar. I was watching. Divankar came over himself about 5 minutes after his subordinate returned to the bar. He walked the way confident young veterans walk when they've chosen to do something and have already decided how it ends. He pulled out the chair across from me, did not ask, just pulled it out and sat in it, and set his drink on the table with the deliberate placement of a man establishing territory. He was large up close. I had already known this. Proximity confirmed it. His eyes were very gold in the low light, the pupils a fine dark line in each. The campaign stripe on his arm was the Kethpreen corridor action, which had run for 18 months and been, by all accounts I had heard, a serious piece of fighting. I did not discount the stripe. Whatever else I thought about how the evening was developing, I did not discount the stripe. He looked at me for a few seconds. The expression was evaluative, the kind of look that is assessing how much resistance it is going to encounter, not whether it will encounter any. Then he said, in the trade dialect most species use when they don't want to bother with species-specific grammar, "You're a long way out for a soft worlder." I picked up my glass and drank a small amount from it. "This is a rough stretch of corridor," he said. "Things happen to travelers who don't know the terrain." I set the glass down. "You don't look like you know the terrain," he said. There was a quality to what he was doing that I recognized very well. It was a testing sequence. Graduated escalation, starting from a position of assumed superiority, looking for the point at which the other party folds or reacts. The fold is what they want, some acknowledgement of the hierarchy being established, some visible diminishment. The reaction is the alternative, which they are prepared for and confident about because they are young and recently victorious and there are 8 of them. It is a simple sequence. You can run it at someone who doesn't know what it is, and it works almost every time. You can also run it at someone who knows exactly what it is, and then what happens depends entirely on what that person decides to do with the information. I looked at him. "What world are you from?" he said. The question was not curiosity. It was the next step in the sequence, looking for me to volunteer the specific nature of my softness, the particular classification of my world, so that he could deploy it. "Kale Marit," I said. "This is a designation I have used for almost a decade. It is not the name of my world. It is the name of a small agricultural transit hub in the middle lanes that sits somewhere between uninteresting and actively dull. Nobody ever follows up on it. The Vorath-Senn do not maintain detailed files on mid-range transit infrastructure. Deathworlders did not follow up on it." He had not expected me to answer at all. The calm delivery of a false world name had not been in the sequence, and it took him a fractional pause to reacquire the thread. In that pause, I saw something I had seen many times, the small recalibration of a young man who has encountered an input that does not match the expected pattern. He wrote it off. That was the right call from his position. He was correct that the most likely explanation was simply that I was a harmless old man who happened to be calm. He was simply incorrect about the harmless part, and in his position, there was no information available to him that would have corrected this. I understood his error completely. It was a reasonable error. I had spent considerable effort ensuring it was reasonable. The civilian clothes, the cheap drink, the unremarkable face, the false mid-lane world name, these were not deceptions I maintained out of paranoia. They were the natural end state of a long process of understanding that what I was could not be carried visibly in civilian space without producing consequences I had no interest in managing. Attention is a tax. The back corner table, the forgettable exterior, the quiet, these were how I paid as little of that tax as possible. On most evenings it was entirely sufficient. On this particular evening, it had encountered a variable I had assessed correctly and handled without particular difficulty, but had nonetheless been required to engage. I noted the engagement in the way I noted all such engagements, as a data point, not a problem. The data point said that the variable in question was within expected parameters and had resolved without cost to anyone who did not deserve the cost. That was an acceptable outcome. I filed it and returned to the sequence. "Mid-lane soft worlder," he said, and his tone shifted slightly, losing the interrogatory quality and picking up a flatter, more declarative edge. "You should have stayed in the middle lanes." I did not answer. I looked at my drink. He reached across the table and picked up my glass. This is the moment people always ask about, and I understand why, because from the outside it is the moment when the thing that is going to happen becomes visible. From the inside, it was not a moment. It was just the next data point in a sequence I had been tracking since he sat down, and it landed exactly where I had calculated it would land, and I had already decided how I was going to handle it before he moved his hand. He held my glass up, looked at the amber content with an expression of contemptuous appraisal, and then set it down in front of himself. I looked at my empty space on the table where the glass had been. Then I looked at him. "You want to ask for it back," he said. His squad at the bar had gone partially quiet. Not all the way, there was still a low murmur from the far end, but the nearest 4 or 5 had pivoted and were watching with the particular attention of a group that has moved from ambient awareness to interested observation. Not alarm, interest. The entertainment the evening had been promising was resolving. I was aware of several things simultaneously in the way that you are after enough years. The weight and layout of the room, the positions of the other occupants, the distance from my table to the bar, the specific posture and tension in each of the Vorath-Senn soldiers I could see from my sightline. The heavy sergeant was watching from the bar rail, arms folded, the expression of a man who expects to observe something predictable and is not wrong to expect it. The youngest of the group down at the far end had turned all the way around on his stool. The Tharvan at the short end of the bar had not moved. He was still. He had been watching me, I now registered, for longer than the current sequence. He had been watching me since before Deathworlders sat down. He was watching me with the specific quality of attention that is neither bystander curiosity nor threat assessment. It was something else. I noted it without resolving what it was and set it aside. I gave my full attention to Deathworlders. "You want to ask for it back," he said again, slightly louder. The slight increase in volume was not aggression. It was performance calibrated for the audience at the bar. "No," I said. He did not react for a moment. "No." "You can keep the glass," I said. "I'll order another one." This was also not in the sequence. The sequence has a limited number of expected branches, and none of them is the quarry declining to contest the seizure and simply announcing an intention to order a replacement. The calculation behind the sequence is that the quarry's options are to fight for the object or to submit, and either option produces the desired result. The third option, indifference to the object, is not legible to the sequence. It doesn't process as compliance or defiance. It processes as something that has no category. I watched him not know what to do with it. He had 2 paths available. He could accept the non-response, declare the outcome close enough to the intended one, and return to his group with a story that held together on the surface. Some squad leaders would have done this. It was the economical choice. Or he could escalate because the non-response was itself a kind of refusal, the refusal to engage on his terms, and escalation would re-establish the terms. Deathworlders was young and recently decorated, and his squad was watching. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he decided. I watched the decision happen, the slight set of the jaw that precedes a Vorath-Senn physical escalation, and he reached across the table and put his hand flat on my chest and pushed. Not hard enough to knock me out of the chair, enough to demonstrate that he could, a punctuation mark. I absorbed the push the way you absorb something you expected. My chair rocked a few centimeters back. I put one foot on the ground to arrest the motion, and then I was still again. I looked at the hand still on my chest. "You're very small," he said, "for a creature that needs to be taught manners in person." I took the hand on my chest by the wrist. Not grabbing, not a quick movement. A deliberate contact, fingers closing around the wrist joint, the particular grip that positions the thumb across the radial process. He felt it happen and started to pull back, and I let him pull back, because what I needed from that contact had already been transmitted in the moment of contact, and what had been transmitted was not information for him. It was information about him. Specifically, the joint structure, the rotational limit, the particular way his forearm tendons loaded when he initiated the pull, which told me the angle of the shoulder and the depth of the socket and the available range. A Vorath-Senn shoulder locks at approximately 94 degrees of external rotation. The joint at the wrist is narrower than the comparable structure in a human. The elbow has a different flexion pattern. I had known all of this. Now I had confirmed it against this specific individual, and the confirmation mattered because the difference between general knowledge and applied knowledge is the difference between being told a door is locked and having your hand on the handle. He pulled his hand back and looked at me with something that was edging away from confident into something else. Not fear. He was a long way from fear, which was still a reasonable position from his informational perspective. The edging was more like the start of a category error. I had not behaved correctly, not in either of the expected ways, and the category error was beginning to register at the edges of his expression. "What are you?" he said. The question was low between us, not for the room. "I told you," I said, "Kale Merritt." He stared at me. The question had been genuine, not rhetorical, not performance. The sequence had produced an output that the sequence's logic could not account for, and the honest version of the question underneath all the performance was beginning to surface. What am I actually sitting across from? He had not found the answer yet. He was about to try a different method. Then he reached across, slower this time, and gripped my forearm. The grip of Vorath-Senn uses when they intend to establish control over a smaller subject is a rapid pull. The hand locks around the forearm above the wrist and draws back and slightly up, which rotates the smaller person's shoulder and puts them at a mechanical disadvantage. It is effective against most species at most size differentials. Against a human who has been expecting it and has already located the counter, it is the beginning of a short demonstration. I let him pull. I let him pull for exactly the distance required, which brought my arm to the angle I needed and his elbow to the extended position, and then I turned my forearm inside his grip, supination, the inside of the wrist rotating up through the space his thumb had left, and the physics of what happened next were not a choice I made. They were the consequence of the configuration. His grip broke outward. His elbow came to the point where the joint locks. I put my other hand behind that elbow lightly, as a suggestion rather than a force, the lightest pressure, barely a touch, and held the position. He could not complete the forward pull. He could not rotate his wrist to release. He could move backward, which would require him to stand and step back, which in the space of the booth would put him between the table and the bar in a position that was mechanically worse than the current one. He could hold still. He held still. I was aware that the room had gone very quiet. The particular quality of that quiet was worth noting, because it was not the same quiet the room had been building toward during the earlier exchanges. Those had produced the interested murmur of observers watching something they expected to resolve predictably. This was different. This was the quiet that happens when a room full of people have registered that the prediction was wrong, and are now updating their models with insufficient data, and therefore not speaking while they wait for more. I held the position for approximately 4 seconds, not long, long enough. Then I released it. I let go of everything, the elbow support, the forearm contact, and put both my hands flat on the table in front of me, in the open, in plain sight, and I looked at him. He pulled his arm back slowly. He did not rub the elbow or the wrist, a point of pride that. He was young, but he had discipline. He sat back in the chair, and he looked at me with the full recalibration of a man who has just received information about the world that requires significant reclassification of the current situation. The room was quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a bar between conversations, the ambient noise of people eating and drinking and moving around each other. This was a different quality. This was the quiet that happens when a room full of people who have been trying to not look at something decide collectively that they are no longer going to pretend to not look. The tile game in the far corner had stopped. The salvage workers at the center table were all awake and facing my direction. The courier near the door had set down the handheld. The bartender, Vressa, had set down the glass she had been drying and was holding it, and the cloth separately and motionlessly in front of her. Divankar's squad at the bar was very still. That, said the Tharvan at the short end of the bar, is what you should have led with. He said it quietly, in precise and old-fashioned trade dialect, in the voice of someone who has been waiting to speak for some time, and is now choosing to speak because the moment has arrived. He had not moved from his position. He was still hunched over his untouched drink, facing the bar, but his head had turned fractionally so that he was addressing the room obliquely without quite facing anyone directly. "Excuse me," said Divankar without looking away from me. "I said," the Tharvan repeated at the same quiet volume, "that is what you should have led with, knowing what you were dealing with before you dealt with it. That is the principle you missed." Divankar's head turned slowly to the Tharvan. The expression on his face was the particular configuration that happens when a conversation has taken a third unexpected turn in a short period of time, and the expected outcome model has stopped producing useful predictions. He looked at the old Tharvan the way you look at something that has said an intelligible thing from an unintelligible location. "Do you know something?" he said. Not a question exactly, more a statement with the grammar of a question. "I know several things," said the Tharvan. "I know the name on your campaign stripe. I know the action that earned it. I know that 18 months in the Kethprene corridor is a serious and difficult thing to survive, and I do not diminish it." He paused. He turned his drink on the bar slowly, the 4 thin fingers moving it a quarter rotation without lifting it. "I also know that the man you just put your hand on completed 4 full deployments in the outer reach before the corridor action was a concept anyone had thought to name. I know the specific theater. I know the specific unit, the 14th Reach Infantry, Sergeant Major's billet, which is the billet you give a man when you have run out of ways to describe how thoroughly he has survived things that were supposed to kill him. I know that the Vorath-Senn, the 14th Reach engaged on the 4th deployment, were not Southern Border Corps. They were the Northern Assault Formation." He paused. "You know the Northern Assault Formation." The room was very quiet. Divankar's eyes moved back to me. I was looking at my empty space on the table where my glass had been. The Northern Assault Formation. I had not said anything about it. I had not said anything about the 14th Reach. I had not said anything about anything. I had given him a false world name and watched him pick up my glass. But the Tharvan was not wrong, and the specific quality of silence that followed his speaking of those words told me that among the Vorath-Senn at the bar, the Northern Assault Formation was not an unknown reference. "You fought the Northern Formation," said the heavy sergeant from the bar. He was not performing. His voice had dropped to the register of a man asking a serious question. I did not answer. "Sergeant Major," said Divankar slowly, as though testing the words for weight. He was looking at my face. "What is the classification of your world?" I picked up the glass that Vressa had set in front of me at some point during the last minute. She had moved without my noticing, which was either a function of the conversation or a function of getting old, and I drank a small amount from it. "You mentioned my world," I said. "What is its classification?" he said again. I set the glass down. I thought about whether to answer. I thought about the various reasons not to, the sealed record, the operational classification, the years of careful practice at being a person with an unremarkable middle lane world name who drank cheap spirits in back corner tables. I thought about those reasons, and then I thought about Divankar, and the stripe on his arm, and the question he had just asked, which was a genuine question, delivered without performance, in the voice of a young veteran who had just discovered that his model of the evening needed significant revision, and was asking for the data required to complete the revision. He had asked correctly, that mattered. I thought about Karvith, who had been the 14th's communications officer, and who had grown up on a mountainside on a world where the local fauna had 17 kinds of venom, and the seasonal predator migrations made the valleys impassable for 4 months of the year, and who had always been quietly astonished that anyone found any of this remarkable. I thought about Marin, the corporal from the 4th deployment, who had taken a Vorath-Senn northern formation blade in the side going into a doorway on a world whose name I still did not say in conversation, and who had finished the clearance sequence before she acknowledged the wound, and who had sat down in the hallway afterward and eaten the ration bar she had been saving for 2 days because she thought it was a reasonable time for a ration bar. I thought about the debrief after the Pelthai-7 engagement in the medical bay, when the attending Keth Sauron medic had looked at the scan results and asked me in a tone of genuine inquiry whether I understood that the compressive loading I had sustained across my thoracic spine during the extraction was, by the biomechanical parameters of every known species, not a survivable event. I had told him I understood that. I thought about 30 years of that kind of accumulation, and the kind of patience it produces, and the particular silence that lives behind that patience, which is not peace, but is the next thing to it. Class 18, I said. The Tharvan put his drink down and did not pick it up again. Divankar did not move. I want to be careful here because I have seen people tell the story of this moment as though it was a triumph, as though the room going quiet was a victory, as though the Vorath-Senn Sergeant Major's expression was a prize. That is not how it felt from the inside. From the inside it felt like what it was, a cold disclosure of a cold fact. I was not proud of the classification. I was not ashamed of it. It was the world I came from, which I had not chosen, the same way no one chooses the world they come from. What the classification meant for the biology it had produced in me was not something I had earned. I had simply used what I was given over a long period of time as carefully as I knew how. A Class 18 designation means, in the Compact's standard environmental threat taxonomy, that the world in question presents sustained lethal threat indices across atmospheric chemistry, geological instability, endemic pathogen load, hydrological hazard, and megafauna predation that, in aggregate, register above the Compact's upper recorded threshold for continuous habitation. There are, at last count, fewer than a dozen Class 18 designations in the known catalog. The classification is not a claim. It is a measurement. The measurement says, this world kills everything that goes there at all times without pause, and the life that has evolved to live there anyway has evolved to survive exactly that. I was what Kale Prime had made me. I had been a small child once, catching my first significant wound from a ground predator before I was 4 years old, and thereafter adjusting. The adjustment had taken 31 years to complete. The version sitting in the bar at Vorath-Senn waystation, 61 years old and significantly past the field-ready peak of the adjustment, was still, by any measurement available to the galaxy, not a reasonable thing to put your hand on without knowing what you were dealing with. The Tharvan had known. He had known since before the Vorath-Senn came through the door, which was why he had gone still the moment they arrived, and had been watching me instead of them. He had made a calculation, which was that if the Vorath-Senn did something that required a response, the response would not be coming from him, and if the response came from me, it would be sufficient, and if it was not sufficient then there was nothing he could do about it anyway and worrying was unproductive. He had managed his own unease by locating the thing in the room that was more formidable than the thing that unsettled him, and then paying close attention to it. This was, I reflected, a reasonable strategy. I had used versions of it myself. The 14th reach, said Divankar carefully. You were the 14th reach. I was, I said. The Pelthai system, he said, the 4th deployment. I looked at him. We know about the Pelthai's engagement, he said. His voice was flat now. Not the flat of performance, the flat of a man who is looking at a fact and trying to match the fact to the context he is currently occupying. The Northern Formation lost contact with 3 full fire teams inside the first 6 hours of the engagement. The reports on the Northern Formation side describe. He stopped. Describe what? Said the heavy sergeant from the bar. He was leaning forward. Divankar looked at me. What they describe, he said, does not match what I see in front of me. What they describe, said the Tharvan, is accurate. There was a long pause. The young one at the far end of the bar said something in bordercore dialect, too low and too clipped for me to follow, and the one next to him answered in a flat murmur, and the exchange died without any visible emotional resolution. Two of the others had turned fully on their stools to face my direction, not aggressively. They had moved past that, but with the specific attention of soldiers updating a briefing in real time. Vressa set a new glass in front of Deathworlders without being asked. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. "You're retired," he said. "I am," I said. "And you're out here." He gestured, not quite at anything specific, at the station, the outer corridor, the general configuration of being in this particular bar on this particular waystation, far from anywhere that mattered. "I am," I said. He absorbed this for a moment. Something moved through his expression that I could not quite name, not discomfort, exactly, and not embarrassment, though embarrassment was part of it. Something more like the specific kind of recalibration that happens when you have constructed a model of an evening, and the evening has turned out to be a completely different thing from the model, and you are sitting in the ruins of the model trying to locate where the error was introduced. I had watched officers do this after engagements that had not gone as anticipated. The good ones located the error and filed it. The rest spent energy on the wrong question. Deathworlders, I thought, was going to locate the error and file it. "Why?" he said, not aggressively, genuinely. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the honest version, which was that the galaxy is very large and there are corners of it where nobody expects anything from you, and you can drink your malt spirit in a back corner table and watch whatever comes through the door and decide how to handle it or not handle it entirely on your own terms, without a chain of command or an obligation to a classification or any of the machinery that spends your productive years, and then releases you with a discharge paper and a handshake, and the assumption that what you are will stop being what you are once the paperwork says so. I thought about explaining that retirement is not, for people from Class 18 worlds, the same category of event that it is for most species. Most species retire and soften. The metabolic and neurological hardware that a Class 18 world installs in its children does not significantly soften. It just redistributes, becomes patience instead of velocity, becomes a different kind of watchfulness, quieter and lower, and without the particular energy cost of active operation. The machinery keeps running. It simply runs without an assigned purpose, which is its own kind of difficulty, and which requires its own kind of management. I had found my management. It was this table and this drink and this station. I thought about saying all of that, and I decided it was too many words. "It's quiet," I said. Deathworlders looked at me for another moment. Then, slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood up. He retrieved my original glass, the one he had taken, and set it carefully on the table in front of me. He had not drunk from it. He picked up the new glass Vressa had set down and held it for a moment, and then he inclined his head, which in Vorath-Senn gesture grammar is a small acknowledgement, not an apology, not quite, but the next thing over. It is the gesture you use when you have assessed a situation incorrectly and the correct assessment has been demonstrated to you. "Sergeant Major," he said. I did not correct the rank. I was technically retired and the correct form was former or ret, but the protocol was a secondary matter. In this context, Deathworlders meant it the way it was meant, and that was sufficient. He went back to the bar. There was a brief, murmured conversation between him and his squad that I did not try to hear. Then they began finishing their drinks with more focus than they had previously applied to the task, and within roughly 15 minutes they were done and leaving, and the main hatch closed behind them, and Vorath-Senn Level 3 was quieter than it had been all evening. The tile game resumed in the far corner. The salvage workers returned to their meal. The courier picked up her handheld. I drank my drink. After a while the Tharvan, still at the short end of the bar, spoke again. "I apologize for the disclosure," he said, still not quite facing me. "I calculated that the alternative was worse." "It was the right call," I said. "You had it handled," he said. "I had the next step handled," I said. "Whether that would have been sufficient depends on how many steps they had left in them. Your intervention shortened the sequence." He was quiet for a moment. "I was on Pelthai 7, he said. "Not your engagement, the one before. The survey mission 18 months prior, before the compact designated it active." I looked at him. He was still not quite facing me. The bluish-gray scales of his face and neck had the texture of something that had been in cold weather for a long time, slightly contracted, the tones compressed. He was old, older than I had initially assessed. The kind of old that accumulates specifically in people who have spent significant time in places that cost them something. "We were there for 3 weeks, he said. "We lost 4 of the survey team in the first 6 days, not to hostile contact, to the world itself." He turned his drink a quarter turn on the bar. "We were told before departure that the preliminary environmental assessment rated the planet at Class 14, hazardous, potentially lethal, adequate precautions recommended." He paused. "The Compact's environmental division recalibrated the designation to Class 18 after they received our field data." "I know," I said. "I know you know," he said. "I know because it was your unit's engagement data 18 months later that completed the recalibration. The Pelthai 7 data set is the reason the Compact added 2 new threat indices to the Class 18 measurement criteria." He paused. "It is also the reason the Compact's Civilian Advisory Board recommended, by majority vote, that the 14th Reach be given whatever they wanted in terms of assignment parameters and be asked very politely, and with great sincerity, never to do anything like that again without prior approval." I looked at my drink. "I did not know that last part," I said. "It was not made widely available," he said. He picked up his drink for the first time and looked at it without drinking from it. "I was on the review board at the time, in a junior capacity." He set the glass down again. "I saw the engagement footage." I did not say anything. "I understand," he said carefully, "why you choose a quiet corner." I thought about the footage and what it contained. I had not seen the final compiled version. That was also sealed. But I had been present for what it documented, and the gap between being present for something and watching it reconstructed from external sensors was a gap I was not certain I wanted to close. What the footage showed, presumably, was the 14th at full operational tempo on a world rated Class 18, which in practice meant a team of human beings moving through an environment that was simultaneously trying to kill them from every available direction, doing the work of a combat operation, and maintaining the particular cold procedural quality that the 14th maintained regardless of what the operational environment was doing. From the outside, I had been told by people who had seen partial versions, it looked like something that did not have a useful comparison point. Inside it, it had looked like work. "The young ones," said the Tharvan after a moment, "the Vorath-Senn squad, they will be better for the evening." "Possibly," I said. "The squad leader," he said, "Divonkar, he asked the right question at the right time." "He did," I said. "That is the difference," said the Tharvan. He turned his glass on the bar again, the slow, deliberate quarter rotation, and looked at it. "The ones who ask what am I dealing with when the information becomes available, against the ones who do not ask. That is the entire difference, across every species and every engagement and every moment in history when the answer would have mattered." He paused. "The Northern Assault Formation, in the 4th deployment engagement, did not ask. The record shows they had sufficient data to ask well before the engagement reached its critical phase." "The record is accurate," I said. We sat without speaking for a little while. The ambient noise of the bar had returned to its ordinary level, the soft background of a late evening in a place where people are winding down rather than winding up, the low scrape of chairs, the diminishing murmur of the tile players, the distant clank of Vressa's cleaning routine. The kind of sounds a room makes when it has decided nothing more is going to happen tonight. I finished my drink. I thought about Deathworlders and his squad, out in the station corridors by now, heading toward whatever billet or transit connection had brought them through Vorath-Senn. I thought about what the next conversation in that squad would sound like, and I thought it would probably be a quieter conversation than the ones they had been having before they came through the door. Not a damaged conversation, they had not been broken, and they had not needed to be, but a different one. The kind you have after the world has updated your model of it in a specific and useful way. I had been on the receiving end of those conversations, from the other direction, when I was young. They are uncomfortable while they are happening and clarifying afterward. I thought about what Deathworlders would do with the recalibration. I thought about the campaign stripe on his arm and the real scar tissue on his neck ridge, and the quality of the question he had asked when his certainty had run out. I thought he would probably be all right. He had asked the right question at the right time. He had asked, "What am I dealing with?" once the information was available to ask about, and he had held the answer without flinching, which is the specific skill that separates the officers who survive from the ones who don't. He would carry the evening differently than he had arrived carrying it. That was probably useful. I did not know and did not need to know. It was not my concern. I put the appropriate amount on the bar for the 2 drinks and the inconvenience of the evening. Vressa took it without comment, which was what I expected. She had been running this bar for 20 years and had, based on her expression at no point during the Vorath-Senn visit, been unduly alarmed by any of it. She had the expression of someone who manages the expected. She had managed the evening, and the evening was now over. I put on my coat. The Tharvin was still at the short end of the bar. He had still not touched his drink. "Get some sleep," I said as I passed. He made a small sound that I interpreted as agreement. I walked back to my quarters on level 2, which were small and adequately cold and exactly as I had left them. I hung up my coat. I did not turn on the overhead light. The bunk light was sufficient, and I had been operating in low-light environments since before I could name what a low-light environment was. I sat on the edge of the bunk and took off my boots and set them where I could find them quickly, and then I lay back and looked at the overhead. The station's internal hum was steady. Somewhere forward, a coupling joint was cycling on a 12-second rhythm, the faint vibration of it moving through the hull plating and into the bunk frame. I had been hearing that rhythm for 11 months. I was not troubled. I was not proud or relieved or any of the things people assume you are after an evening of that kind. I was tired in the way you are at 61 when you have been maintaining watchfulness for several hours, which is a different kind of tired than young tired. Deeper and quieter and more specific. The kind that finds the particular muscle groups you have been holding without knowing you were holding them, and releases them one by one. I thought about Kale Prime briefly, the mountain basin where I had grown up, where the overcast is permanent for 9 months of the year, and the ground predators move through the basin fog at dawn in patterns. You learn to read before you learn to read anything else. The weight of the air there. The particular quality of cold that is not temperature alone, but the whole environmental fact of a world that is actively indifferent to your survival in every measurable dimension, which produces in the children who survive it a specific calibration. Not courage. Courage is a response to fear, and fear requires the belief that the threat exceeds your capacity. The calibration I mean is something different. The absence of the assumption that the world will cooperate with your plans for it. The deep understanding, installed before conscious memory, that the thing in front of you is not obligated to be manageable, and that whether you manage it anyway is simply a question of preparation and attention and patience. That calibration does not go away at 61. It deepens. It becomes a background frequency you run everything else against. It is why the back corner of any room is the right seat. It is why 4 seconds in a wrist lock tells you everything you need to know. It is why the Tharvan on the short end of the bar was correct to identify me before Divankar sat down, and why Divankar was correct to update his model the moment the information was available. The lesson, if there was one, was not mine to teach. I had not been teaching. I had been sitting in a bar at the end of an ordinary evening, and something had come through the door, and I had handled it the way I handled things, with the minimum necessary, patiently, without announcement. The squad would take whatever they took from it. The Tharvan would file it wherever old men file the evenings they carry home from far corridor waystations. Vressa would open the cafe tomorrow morning and set out the morning draft, and the night would become part of the station's ambient history, unremarked and unremarkable. The galaxy is large. It contains a significant number of things that will end you without announcement or ceremony. Most of those things do not look like the things most species expect dangerous things to look like. They look like small, gray-haired, unremarkable creatures in the back corner of a quiet bar, nursing a cheap malt spirit at the end of a quiet evening. The coupling joint cycled again. The bunk frame absorbed the vibration. I closed my eyes. The morning would come on schedule, and there would be a table in the back corner, and the cafe would open, and Vressa would set out the morning draft, and whoever came through the main hatch would come through it, and whatever they brought with them would be what it was. I would be there. I had always been good at waiting. It was the first thing Kale Prime had taught me before I had the words for it, and it was the last thing I expected to lose.